Hi, my name's Andy Hodgson, and I want to take this next minute to chat to you a little bit about the Emerging Leaders Program and why you should consider it for yourself, for the leaders you're developing, or as a partnership for your church or ministry organisation. You know, before sending out the 12, Jesus says, "The harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into his harvest field." We still believe this to be the case today, and that's why we want to equip and train disciple-making and movement-building leaders to be sent, so that we may see disciple-making movements launched in all church and community contexts across Australia. The Emerging Leaders Program is an opportunity for leaders to establish their leadership now and to impact their future ministry. Our heart is to equip, train, and launch generations of leaders who think movements like Jesus did, who live authentically as disciple makers in their everyday life, and who are known to be kingdom-minded. We explore the life of Jesus as our model of leadership and lifestyle. By journeying through Jesus' life chronologically, we discover his priorities, his methods, his mission, and his model. And then we work hard to help to implement these priorities in your personal lives and ministries that you lead through coaching, mentoring, and practical application. In addition to this, we recognise the importance of accredited biblical and theological studies. So through our partnership with ACOM, students engage in academic study anywhere from a higher ed diploma through to a master's. We also further explore specific leadership skills for today, and we do this all as a learning cohort. And so we'd like you to consider being a part of any of our programs so that you can be equipped, trained, and launched. So together we can see disciple-making movements through your life and leadership.
Thanks. Well, it's a real privilege to be here. I'm really excited to spend some time with you. I'd like us to start just chatting a little bit about kind of what we're wanting to get out of today. So I'll introduce myself first, so just so you know who I am. So I'm a mum of 3 kids. So I've got a 16-year-old, a 14-year-old and a 12-year-old. So we are right in the middle of kind of teenage world, which is exciting. And one of those is currently shipped off for a term to Clunes, to another school campus where they go and live for a whole entire term. So it's we're in a new kind of season of growing independence in our house, which is an exciting stage. I'm also director of microchurches, as Andrew said, but it's microchurches is Australia is a funny organisation because I worked really hard not to start it for a very long time. For about 18 months, I had people asking me to start this organisation, and I intentionally fought it. And then when we did start it, I've kept it non-financial until the last few months, because I was really intent that we didn't need another organisation selling another bucket load of training for people to do. What we needed was thought leadership in this space and collaboration, and particularly within an Australian context, because we get a lot of stuff that comes into Australia from the US or from the UK, but I don't know what you guys think. My sense is that the context in Australia is different enough that we actually need to start thinking about what are we doing here and how do we contextualise it. So that's a bit of my heart for Microchurches Australia. I'm also an ordained Anglican minister still, so they haven't chucked me out, which is an achievement in my line of work when you're playing with microchurches in a traditional denomination. So they've actually even accepted them in the last year or two as a method of church planting for the Anglican Church. So that's been a kind of exciting win. And I think one of my big hopes for Microchurches Australia is that, say, in 10 years, it doesn't exist. It doesn't need to exist, because denominations and other organisations have taken on microchurches as just a part or a method of one model of what they can do. And so we don't need a separate organisation to support that moving forward. So, yeah, that's my heart. My hope is to make myself redundant within 10 years, which I think is what we should all be aiming for as disciples. So I want to start. I don't know if this is going to work. Nah. Let me. Hang on. Let me turn it off and on. Nah. There we go. Let me just start by asking you a question. What are you hoping to get out of today? We'll start with those in the room, and then I might actually get you guys online to share. what are you hoping for? What are you hoping to get out of today? Okay, that's me, that's my crew. And in that top corner is actually the very first micro church that we ever planted, and it's my daughter standing up the front, actually leading our micro church in our lounge room in some form of worship. She's now 16, and one of my, I guess, the most exciting things that I see at micro churches, so she was 6 in that picture, is that she's 16 and she's just launched her first micro church. She's leading it. She's effectively planting a church. But she's been raised in this, so this is what she's done since she was 6. This is the form of church that she knows and understands. But that's where it's led to, and I would have never dreamt of that. That was not what I expected. That's not what I thought we'd see. That was not even an outcome I even imagined was possible. There we go. I just got to push really hard. So let me share a little bit of my story. So I was the senior associate pastor at Glenwaverley Anglican Church, so a church of about 500 or 600 people. I'm probably on the more charismatic end of the Anglican Church, so I actually had a pretty strong picture from God that was really encouraging me to get our church outside of the building. But we had no idea how to do that, like none. So I feel like I need to precursor all of this and say, what I'm going to teach you today is kind of accidental learnings that we learned along the way. I didn't sit down and come up with this theological view on micro churches and then implement it. It just wasn't like that. This is practical theology that's come back, looked at what God has done in our context and said, oh, maybe this is why. So this is kind of our story. We launched a pilot community in 2012. Very soon afterwards, we multiplied out to 2 other communities, one for single adults, one for families, which was kind of the majority of the pilot community.
I can't read that because I'm old.
That's okay. You don't need to see the details on that, and you'll get all these slides anyway. Really, what I want to demonstrate is just the way that this is just a bit slow. Getting closer and closer. There we go. So the Vine, the bottom one there, was our first young adults community that we launched. A year later, it multiplied into 3, and then into 2, and then some others multiplied, and then we planted a church. And it looks really impressive when you put it up on a page like that, but it was really messy. It was really complex, but it was really exciting. And I think that's where I want us to start. When you think about micro churches, the ability to multiply those out and out and out is like, there's no way you would have planted that many churches if you were trying to do buildings and the whole works. But it's uncontrollable, I guess is what I'm saying. There is a level at which you can curate and you can support and encourage, and we were very thankful to be able to keep all of these within the same network and support structure. But in reality, it had to be let to kind of go. And so what we actually ended up with is one of those ones at the top, the Mandarin congregation, actually multiplied out to be a church congregation. So it actually went from being a micro church to being a standard church congregation, because we saw all these people come to faith. And for a long time, actually, we saw these people come to faith, these Mandarin speakers come to faith, and then they'd go down the road from our church to another Mandarin-speaking church, which was great and good for the kingdom, but a little bit frustrating for our leaders in that space. So in the end, they started a Mandarin congregation, and God has grown that, and that's a great thing. So I'm not model specific here. What I want to share with you is just what we did and how we learnt from it. You'll notice down the bottom, there's 3 that have been kind of divided off. That's a new church plant that we launched last year. Basically, we planted one of the communities into Monash Uni. It multiplied out, and then we ended up kind of realising that there was very little connection in that space back to the original church. You can see it's kind of 3 to 4 generations down of micro churches. And so we've actually taken that and planted that, and that community is called the Scent Collective, which is a new church plant that, of course, launched in the middle of COVID, along with lots of other things. One of the other things that I'm really excited about with this picture, though, is all the leaders that are developed along the space. So we didn't set out to do a leadership development program. We set out to reach people in our community and see people come to faith, which was great. We saw that. But what I've noticed since then is the amount of people who have come through this and have ended up either continuing and leading on, like my daughter, who's now launching her community. The girl who's launched the Scent Collective church plant, she was a leader in the Vine. So she was a kind of assistant leader in the Vine, which is our first young adults community. She was the leader of the Monash missional community, and then she ended up being the leader of that church plant. One of the ladies who's the leader of the one that's called Fitness, which actually had another name, but I can't remember what it was. She's gone on to work at another church now and is doing these at another church. The person who planted the Vine went on to work going to ministry at a church, an Anglican church in Greensborough, and then they started playing around with these micro churches. Now there's one in South Morang, just near us, where I'm currently working with another church. So there's been this kind of whole range of people that have travelled through this unintentionally and multiplied outside of this network. And I think one of the things that we were intentional about going out and making disciples. We actually weren't intentional about making leaders, but when you make disciples and you release them into ministry, you end up with people who are leading and moving into that space. So that's a bit of our story. So what I want to share with you today is really kind of the lessons that we've learnt along this road, some of my thinking around this. Another part of my story at the moment is I'm doing a doctorate in ministry. And as you might guess from coming out of that, it's around how do we develop innovative missional leaders. And so a lot of this has kind of come out for me to think about, well, we kind of accidentally did it. How do we actually more intentionally do this? And how do we do so specifically within the Australian context and with those that are innovators or pioneers or entrepreneurs, those sorts of styles of people. So that's kind of part of my story and my area of interest. So we're going to have a bit of a time to do a couple of back things. Before we get to micro churches, I want to kind of go through two key things that I think are important to set up micro churches. And I'm hoping for people this is a no-brainer and it's stuff you're really used to. So I want to fly through it if I can get the clicker to work with me. So to be able to engage in the micro church conversation, I think we have to have a solid understanding of what is the mission of God. What is it that we are called to as people, as people who follow Jesus, right? What is it? What is the mission of God? And I actually think there's one part of this, if you're on to the mission of God conversation, if you've seen that through like literature and kind of the missional church space, there's one part of it that I actually think needs to be reframed and readdressed, because I think it actually leads to some unhelpful ways of thinking. I'm going to play with this clicker until it... Thank you, Andrew. So this is kind of the summary of the mission of God conversation. So David Bosch, Transforming Mission, this is like the basic textbook for anyone who's doing any missiological studies. But it's really about understanding that the church itself doesn't have a mission, that God has a mission, and he's invited the church to participate in that mission. Is that common? Is that new information? I'm getting a few nods, so I'm assuming it's pretty common information for people these days. That's not new. And a lot of it came out of David Bosch's work here, where he says the classical doctrine on the mission of God is God the Father sending the Son, the Father and the Son sending the Spirit, and then the final movement, which is what really began the missional church conversation, was actually the Father, Son, Spirit sending the church into the world. And this quote from him, I think, unpacks that really well for us. But I think one thing that I've seen in the missional church conversation has been a really strong focus on doing and on actions and... Thank you. So this is what... I've gone one too far. So mission of God, when we're talking about what is the mission of God, so yes, the church is sent to participate in the mission of God. Jesus talks about the mission of God in Luke 4 when he says, to set the prisoners free, the blind seeing. So it's not just about helping people connect to Jesus and have a one-on-one relationship with him, which sometimes we whittle the gospel down to just individual salvation and that's it. Whereas God has this plan, if you've read scripture obviously, to redeem the whole of creation. So part of what it means to be on about the mission of God is to be people who bring justice, to be people who bring healing, who bring life into those sorts of places. So it's actually participating in God's work in the in the kingdom of God in the earth. So one of the issues that I found a bit with the mission of God conversation is when you talk about the Father sending the Son and the Spirit sending the church into the world, the image of that sometimes can leave us thinking that God has sent us into the world and stayed behind. So when I send my husband out to get milk, if I say, can you go and get milk, I send him to get milk, I don't go with him. Right? By nature, I actually stay home and he goes. And while I don't think any of us would say that theologically, that we would say, oh, we're going on our own, God has sent us, we'd say, oh no, the Spirit goes with us. But in reality, I think we are living very much like, at times, that we have this mission, God has entrusted this mission to us, we need to be doing this, as opposed to holding a kind of more relational edge to it. So if you don't mind, Andrew, there's a guy who's quite a new, I think we've skipped one. Have we? Yeah, there should be another quote. Maybe it's gone. I don't know where it's gone. There you go. Oh well. I must have accidentally deleted a slide.
Not this one?
No. Oh, they've got out of order. Okay. So there's a guy called Sung Chan Kwan who's written some work on John's Gospel. It's a bit further up, I think. Anyway, he's done all this work on the Gospel of John and what we see in the Gospel of John, because what we see in that particular Gospel is this really kind of intentional indwelling between the Father and the Son, right? We see that Jesus is really connected. There's all the stuff about the vine and the branches. There is this sense that even though Jesus is sent into the world, he remains in that union, in that unity and relationship with God. And so he suggested that the way we should be reframing the mission of God is actually seeing that, as the Father and the Son were in perfect unity as they went into the world, the Father and Son send the church and the Spirit in that same unity into the world. And while it's not a big deal to think about in terms of changing this around, I think it is a helpful thing to reframe in the way that we think about this. Because one of the slides is about relationship and responsibility. I don't know where we've got to now, but that's okay. We see it throughout Scripture all the time, right? We see that, I'll find it. In Genesis 1 and 2, we see, we're created for a relationship with God, but we're also created for work. See, Genesis 12, Abraham's called to kind of be a people in relationship with God, but also called to be a blessing to nations. And basically, it lines up, if we skip a bit together, towards this idea that what we're called into in the mission of God is not just about responsibility, it's about relationship and responsibility. And I think that's really important for actually how we frame our own discipleship and the way that we do discipleship with one another, but also the way that we frame mission in our congregations, because a lot of the churches that I've been a part of have been really good at doing relationship when you're with us, but then sending you out in your day job to go and be missional in your own space on your own. And I'm actually not sure that that's particularly biblical. Like, I see lots of examples in Scripture where people are sent together on mission, that we're not actually sent on our own. And there is this sense of, I don't know where we've got to with these, but that's okay, we'll work it out. There is a sense of the importance of balancing that relationship and responsibility. Because I actually don't think that that Jesus ever kind of sends people outside of that relationship, right? Both the relationship with other believers, but also in that relationship with him. And so it's not only important to hold that responsibility, that sense of what it means to be on mission, but it's to hold that level of relationship. And we often talk about relationship and responsibility. So there is some power in discipleship. If we're discipling someone and we don't have a lot of relationship with them, then we don't have a lot of power in actually helping them to step into things. So I think you'll find that it's that balance of relationship and the responsibility that we see Jesus do. You see it with the disciples, right? He calls them into relationship first. He builds that relationship and then he sends them out. He gets them to do things. He sends them out 2 by 2. And he balances those two things side by side, both the relationship and the invitation into doing life with him, and that challenge to actually step into the responsibility that God has for you. Part of being a member of God's family is actually stepping into being a part of God's mission in the world. And those two things, I think, need to be held very much in tandem. And I actually think that's one of the opportunities that you see in the kind of micro-churches space, is that holding of the relationship and the responsibility in tandem. And Mike Breen, who does a lot of work in this sort of space, writes a book called Covenant and Kingdom. And he basically traces these two themes throughout Scripture: the covenant relationship that we're always invited into, and the kingdom responsibility that we're asked to hold and kind of put together into that space. And I think they're two important metrics that we can talk and think through, both when we think about our churches, but when we think about our discipleship. So there's two matrices there. Andrew, can you flick to that first matrices? Because I think this has actually been a really helpful tool that we've used to talk about what does it look like for discipleship, but also for our own relationship with God, right? So if God invites us into covenant relationship, but he also gives us that sense of kingdom responsibility to hold on to, then the place I think that is most fruitful for people to be growing is when they hold both of those in balance. And I would actually say that you can't take responsibility beyond relationship, but when we hold both of those in balance. And so what we often see is if people have a sense of God's responsibility, they have a sense that they need to be out on mission, but they don't have a strong relationship with God, then they end up being in that bottom quadrant there where they're stressed, right? They have this sense of I need to be out here, I need to be doing this, but without the relationship, it's pressure on them and it causes stress. The other thing I think we see a lot in our churches is people with a high relationship with God, but little understanding of their responsibility of the kingdom. And that's when you see that kind of comfortable box. And we're just having a great time with Jesus and this is awesome, right? But I think what we need to be actually making disciples is to hold those two together, to give people an understanding of the relationship that they have with God and their kingdom responsibility, because that's when we see disciples growing. And of course, if you have neither, then they're just a disconnected mess. And so we use this idea to actually think through what does that mean for us as we are discipling other people, right? As I'm discipling someone, if I am just pushing the hard challenge and trying to get them to align their lives to Jesus, I'm going to stress them out if I'm not also investing in that relationship. And this is actually a really, I think, strong underpinning for microchurches. If you go to the final matrices there, I'm going to get you guys to do a bit of a kind of reflection on this in a second. But we use that kind of language of what does it mean to come and follow? You know, Jesus invites people to come and follow him. But he also says, I will make you fishers of men. Right? Those two things are side by side in everything that he does. And I think we can actually review both our own discipleship practices, but even our churches. Like, I think if you look at your church, you get, are you a church that really values relationship? Or are you a church that's kind of got that justice-driven responsibility arm? Because there's some cultural things that I think that then impacts, right? So you're thinking of your church, if it's high focus on relationship with God or even just relationship with one another, you can end up with that kind of chaplaincy, cosy, comfortable culture. Whereas if you've got a church that's really driven on mission, and this is probably where I'm at with the new church plant that we're working at, they are so driven on mission that they're actually getting down to that kind of discouraged culture because they're forgetting that they are loved first. That first and foremost, you see Jesus when he's baptised, right? What does God say over him?
I love you.
Yeah, you are my son whom I'm well pleased. Yep. And what has Jesus done at that point? Nothing. Yeah. That's our starting point. You're my son who I'm well pleased. Then he goes out into the wilderness. And then he's tested. Then he heads out on ministry. But his starting point is you are my son whom I'm well pleased. Yeah. And I think that's really important to hold those in the right order, but hold them together. Because when we're talking about making disciples, and if we're talking about microchurches, you have to be talking about making disciples. So if we're not making disciples, you've just got a cozy little group of friends that are hanging out together. God bless you, it's not church. Right? So I want you to take a minute. You can do it in couples or in tables or however you'd like to do it. Maybe most of you look like you're on screen with others, but if not, maybe we can do some breakout rooms. Just take a look at that matrix, and there's two questions for you. One, where are you sitting personally in your own relationship with God? Is it high covenant? Is it high kingdom? Where might that need to be? Just have a 10-second kind of snapshot, if I was just putting a gut feel, this is where I'd kind of draw myself. And then where is your current church context? So as I said, the little church plant that I'm a part of is a really high challenge at the moment. They're so driven on mission and they're all young and they're all under kind of 29 and full of energy and wanting to change the world, but they are struggling because they haven't actually landed that real sense of, God's pleasure over them and God's joy over them. So take a second, I'll give you 5 minutes, brain dump. Where are you at personally? Where is your church community at? And maybe you guys could just join in tables and just draw the matrices and have a look what you think is coming up for you. That's good. I'll just add one little thing. So some of this stuff comes from some 3DM training that I did, and we've kind of edited it a little bit since then. But one of the things that we'd all like to be able to do, so this is where our church was at GWAC when we started. And as not that we necessarily thought this through at the time, but ideally you want to do this, right? You want to go straight across into there. But the reality is, when you increase the level of challenge, so you're actually telling people they actually need to actually not just sit and enjoy life and enjoy one another's company, what you tend to get is more like that process. This has a nickname in some missional circles as the Valley of the Shadow of Death. Because if your church is used to no responsibility, like -6, and you start wanting to push to 6, that's going to feel like a big increase, right? We've sat in this church for 20 years and nobody said we've ever had to do anything other than show up to church and put money in the plate. So whenever you start lifting the challenge more than that, the feeling of being stressed or discouraged that's a reality. And so just to be aware that this pathway, as much as I'd love to see it, doesn't really exist. This one is easier. You can actually increase the level of relationship and probably fix that one much faster than you can increase the level of challenge, especially when culturally churches have been lacking that challenge for a long time. So when we start thinking about actually how do you launch missional communities and multiply them, this is something just to keep aware of, because it can be quite a challenging time when people start to feel that. And so you really just have to ramp up the relationship alongside of it. But let's move on, because this is where we want to get to talking about actually what is the role of the church. This thing really just doesn't like me today, does it? Let's try again. No, just Andrew's magic fingers. Yeah, they'll do. That's fine. So that's okay. We're just going to talk about I've got my slides in front of me at least now. So what I want to talk about is the role of the church, because to understand what a micro church is, you actually have to have a good idea of what the church is and what the church is called to. Leslie Newbegin is another kind of well-known missional leader, and while he doesn't talk a lot about structures, so a lot of the time when we're talking about churches, we're talking about how we should love one another, we're talking about how we should encourage one another, how we should pray together, and all those things that are kind of who we are rather than what we do. So there's not a lot of times that people actually talk about what the structures of a church should be. But Leslie Newbegin wrote this article that's not very well known in 1977, so talk about a guy ahead of his times, actually thinking through what the shape and structures of mission. And he said, separation there must be for the sake of mission. The white, middle-class suburban congregations of Birmingham, however devoted they might be, cannot and could not function as a sign, foretaste, an instrument of God's purpose or blessing for the immigrants or the shop floor workers on the Leyland assembly lines. There have to be communities where these and others can hear and see, in terms of their own culture, the words and the signs of the gospel. And that was a really unique idea at that time, that actually what we need to do is help people to see the gospel embodied. And that's something that's become big now, but in 1977 no one was talking about it. And so it's quite a unique viewpoint. But he had two key points in that. One, in this article he talks about how the church is generally too large. It's actually just too big to actually effectively disciple people. And his second key point, and that kind of went into the small group movement that was coming out around that time, and the second key movement that was too undifferentiated, that we tried to have one church to reach all sorts of different people. When the reality, what we actually had is one church that tended to reach middle-class, white, working people in Birmingham, but it was never going to reach those working on the shop floors or the immigrants. And he could just see that. And I think if you're in an area that's got a few different cultural areas or groupings or socioeconomic statuses around it, you can see that your church tends to represent one of those at least a lot more than the others. And so that was his point, that actually to reach other people, we need to actually embody the gospel for those people. And I think he's right. And we've got really good examples. So I want to just flick to where there's 3 photos to save you keep flicking. There's 3 examples from history that I like to talk about. Microchurches are not new. I want to make that really clear. This is not some new idea or the best new way to get people into your church. This is not a new thing. And if you read Mark Sayers' book, Reappearing Church, he actually traces how these smaller movements throughout history have been what's revitalised the church. But let me give you 3 examples. Mary Townsend is like a personal hero of mine. And there's a funny story behind it because I was just started launching these micro churches at GWAC. We'd done about a year, and we did the first year in secret. We didn't tell anybody what we were doing. We kind of hustled them out the side and didn't want to have to deal with any conflict. And so we took this little group of people and went out and started living like this. But a few years later, we came back, and I was talking to our Mothers Union group about micro churches, and I was pretty young and probably thought we were doing some really amazing stuff back then, and I was telling these Mother Unions how unique this is. And anyway, an older 80-year-old lady comes up to me afterwards with her scone in her hand and said, what you're doing is not new. This is exactly what Mothers Union was when it started. I went, it's not. Mothers Union was never missional. I don't know if you know what Mothers Union is now, but it's like this Anglican group of older ladies that eat scones and sometimes serve the church flowers and stuff on Mother's Day. That's what I knew of it at the time. But actually, she was right. So Mary Townsend was this amazing woman who'd had this whole life of struggling. So her mum had struggled. She'd watched one of her siblings die. She'd watched her own kids struggle. She gets to this point where she's a grandmother, and she's just sick of watching women struggle. This is kind of post-industrial revolution. The whole dynamics of family are changing. Faith's gone out the window. And this grandmother says, that's it. Convicted by God, she kind of gathers all these women in a room from all different classes, which was not done at that time. So she had her, her lower class women, her upper class women, all sitting in her lounge room, and she gathers them and says to them, she tries to. The first time she gathers them, she gets so nervous she can't speak. She has to leave, and her husband sends them all away. Like anyone else would give up at that point, but this grandmother says, nah, does it again. So the second week they come back, gathers all these people in the room, and she shares her vision for how she thinks God is asking her to support women and families in raising their kids in this new industrial world, and for that to be a place where people can find faith. And so these little communities popped up of mothers just welcoming other mothers, bringing them to faith. If you talk to women who are like 70 or 80, most of them would know Mothers Union, and a lot of them have come to faith through Mothers Union. And it was these little tiny communities of women that scattered all over America and now is all over countries all over the world to raise families with a sense of faith and justice. And really, they were a form of a micro-church. They got kind of swallowed up and adopted into the Anglican Church, which is one of 3 ways that these missional movements often end, according to Howard Snyder and his work on Wesley. But that's one example. John Wesley started the Methodist movement. He's also a hero of mine because for his whole life he was an Anglican. Never accepted by the Anglican Church, but never left the Anglican Church. He started these little kind of bands and societies that spread like a huge revival all over England. But the funny thing is about him is he actually got that from the Moravians. I don't know if you know about the Moravian movement, but there was this all these people who'd kind of fled persecution. They were gathered at a place called Herrnhut in Germany, and they were all kind of Moravians, all had a sense of faith, but really lots of disunity, lots of arguing, lots of fighting. One day in summer, and it was August 13, because we ran our missional leaders training on that day, one day they all gathered together and said, That's it. We need to change our behaviours. They had this big time of repentance and prayer. The Holy Spirit broke out, and then they spread like wildfire across Germany in these little, they called them bands, little smaller groups that were intent on both discipleship and mission. Up until the Moravians, those things tended to be separated, but the Moravians really brought them together. So Wesley went over to see what was going on because he saw what the Moravians were doing, and he did what every good Christian does. He picked up what they were doing and he plonked it in London, and guess what? It didn't work. So the first one he plonked in London just didn't work. So he actually spent some time, and he had 2 iterations later. He had another one which actually did start to work, but then it was actually when he saw what was going on with the miners down in Bristol, and he was kind of convicted of the need to go and preach and reach these miners, that he actually started to work out how to embody this in that context to reach that people. And that's what started the Methodist movement, is he started gathering these smaller groups of people. They were preaching outdoors, they were gathering into these smaller communities, and then they were multiplying across the country. John Smith, God Squad. I think God Squad is a great example of a missional community. From their starting, they always intended to reach bikers and outcasts, and those the church would never reach. They never intended to win them, to bring them back to a church. Depending on your denomination, a lot of our denominations these days have actually accepted the God Squad as a church in their own right. They gather, they worship in kind of forms as the God Squad, they do community together, and they're on mission together, serving all these other people in that area. Now that's spread, all over the world now, the God Squad is. But it's an example of a micro-church. So what I'm trying to get across is this isn't some new fandangled idea. God has been at work doing this for years. It's just that we're kind of getting a sense of that these days. Yeah, so that's John Smith's quote. Like Jesus, we're all friends who we follow. We're committed friends of the outcasts of this world. We're friends not to manipulate our mates to faith, but because we talk and live a faith that is free for all. True love is no weak sentiment. For Christ, it led to crucifixion. To all our mates on the bike scene, we want to say on our anniversary, we're a club that not exists for ourselves, but for our non-members. If you ever need an honest, believing friend, we're here for you, and so is Christ. And that's what John Smith said. I think it was might have been the 30th anniversary of the God Squad organisation. Their heart, you could kind of capture in there. They weren't doing this to win people to faith. They were doing this because they loved people, and they wanted to serve them, and they wanted to see them understand their faith. So that's what I wanted to unpack. This is not new. People have been doing this all the time. God has been at work through this all the time. Mark Sayers says of kind of the Wesleyan movement, it's not that Wesley came up with something new. He discovered what God had always been doing and contextualised it for his time. And I think that's what we're seeing with the microchurch movement in Australia. One of the things that really excites me about microchurches is it hasn't come out of some book or something that's kind of done a tour around Australia and then everyone's gone nuts about it. We're connected. Microchurches Australia is connected to almost 100 different microchurch networks around Australia. And there's, I don't know how many 100 microchurches as part of that. But we didn't start those. Most of those didn't even know that others existed. This is just something that I think God has kind of been sprinkling around Australia, and it's just rising up. And Microchurch Australia, we're just there to kind of gather people together and get that learning and support and encouragement. So I'm a big believer that this is not new. This is something God's always been doing. And if you look back to the early church, you can actually see that this is how the house churches and things have always worked. But one of the things that's big in terms of thinking about microchurches is what is church? And particularly, how do you do that in a microchurch kind of thinking? And there's 5 key elements that I want to talk about that basically form what our view is as church. And the first one is this. It's a Jesus-centred community that models the Father's compassion and love empowered by his Spirit. First and foremost, that is what church is. It's a gathering of people who follow Jesus. And there's verses, and you'll have all those at home. You're welcome to look up those and have a look at them later. But if Jesus isn't at the centre, it's not a church. If the microchurch model is at the centre, that's wrong, right? Jesus needs to be centre of the church. Even the people that we're trying to reach, and this is where microchurches can sometimes go a bit askew, is to put the people they're trying to reach at the centre rather than Jesus at the centre. We might be trying to reach, Mandarin-speaking mums of toddlers or whatever it is it might be, but they're not at the centre. Jesus is at the centre. And when that gets skewed, I think the micro-church thing goes a little awry. So the first thing is they're called to be Jesus-centred communities. The second one is that they're called to worship. So actually I think that's, thanks. I think that is what we're called to as a people generally. We're called to glorify God, right? Worship is both about that kind of Romans 12, that kind of giving off of all that we are for God's glory. But it's also about that kind of John 7 of actually receiving and being filled. Worship isn't just about music. It's about a way of life that actually does both those things. That it gives everything we have to God and it receives from him. The second one is community, and I think that's a no-brainer in Christian community. Like if we're going to be a church, it's about being a gathering of people. We're not a church when we're just one person. But here I think it's really important to emphasise that what we talk about as Christian community, I think sometimes we've got that a bit skewed these days. It's not just about hanging out together. It's not just about enjoying one another's company. When you look at the kind of the New Testament church and the way they did community and the importance of it, there was a sense that it was actually about how we belong, how we find our place, our gifts, using our role for the building up of the church and for the unity. It's also about how we sharpen one another. So there was a deepness to community. And I think sometimes some of our issues in our churches are actually because our level of community is just, an inch deep where it needs to be like so much more than that. Like if people were in real deep relationship with one another where they felt secure, would they be more willing to step out on mission? I think so, genuinely. I actually think part of how we're going to get people out on mission is by learning to do community well and properly, where we actually find a place for everybody, a space of belonging, a space of being able to use their gifts, and where we're willing to actually call each other out on our rubbish. Right? Where I say, actually, what are you talking about? That's not about following Jesus. Let's actually sharpen one another in that space. And then the fourth element is, of course, mission. I think that's a no-brainer. Given what I've talked about, we are actually called to be on about the mission of God, both demonstrating and proclaiming that. So that is words, that is action, embodied action, particularly in the micro-church space, actually joining Jesus on his mission. And the final one I add that most other people working in the micro-church space don't, but I've been hugely convicted that we're actually called to unity as a church. And that means as micro-churches, we're actually called to partnership with one another. I don't think there should be any church that exists in isolation. I actually think you see a beautiful example of the way they're linked through Paul in the early church. You see the way that they all come together. So, at the start of 1 Corinthians, I think it was 1 Corinthians 14, it's, Paul says, when you come together, and the assumption is that these smaller house churches that were meeting in everyone's homes would actually come together. So he says, when you come together, do this, do that, behave like this together. And I think there is a real importance for us as the church to actually be united together. And I think that's probably one of the ways that we are not giving a great testimony to the world of what does it mean to follow Jesus. And so these are the key elements that I often talk about. And they're often talked about as an ecclesial minimum, if you hear that phrase, because they are the kind of minimum things that I think the church needs to be a church. Does that include the Lord's Supper and baptism? Yes. Are they elements of worship? Yes, they are, right? But it's about simple and straightforward. And I've got another activity for you to do. Great, you probably won't be able to see it. But once again, it's about balance, right? This is about balance. So if you have a church, and this is where we think I have a lot of churches, if you have a church that's good at keeping Jesus at the centre, they're great at worship, and they're great at community, but they're really poor at mission, they're usually quite a comfortable church, right? Church that exists for believers and sometimes might outsource mission to other groups, right? If you have a church that perhaps is great at worship and great at mission, but not so good at community, you end up with quite a disconnected community. Often you end up with a collection of justice heroes, as I call them. Everyone's gone out to do their thing to change the world, but we're not actually doing it together. And you can see a lot of burnout and a lot of stress in that space. I think where you see it without worship, so when worship is played down but mission and community is high, you end up with quite a busy community. So that's where you get a lot of the churches that are very social justice focused, but Jesus doesn't get a lot of mention. And then obviously where you see the church without Jesus at the centre, it's just straight out dangerous. And so I want you to take a second and actually have a think about your church. If this is your ecclesiology, if you were thinking about how do we rate our church in terms of worship, in terms of community, and that really deep sense of community and mission, Jesus-centeredness, and then our partnership with others, how would you draw your church? In those circles, how would you draw them? Would they be out of line one way, or I'll do that in a minute, or maybe they'd be all about worship with very little community and mission? The church that you're a part of at the moment, how would you draw it? Now, you might not draw it like this. You might have 3 totally disconnected circles. That's up to you. But it's a way of thinking about if this is what we call a simple ecclesiology or a basic ecclesiology, where is your church at? Because this informs how we actually move forward with micro-churches.
Has, in recent times, like with church governance and compliance to policies, has that impacted on much on micro-churches?
Yeah, it has. It's impacted micro-churches in some good ways, in that it's made the denominations actually go, oh, we've got these micro-churches out there with our name on them, saying they're, Anglican micro. The only reason the Anglicans are doing something about micro-churches is because they're worried about child safety stuff happening within them, which is great because it means they're actually now paying attention to them and engaging with them. The nice thing about micro-churches is you don't generally deal with kids that aren't in family units. So you're not like a program, you're not taking kids away from their families or away from their parents, which makes some of that child safety stuff easier. On the other hand, meeting in people's homes has its own risks. So that's kind of a different area that needs to be covered off. But I think it's one of the reasons that we need to be in unity. Because one of the things that I've noticed is that the most flourishing micro-churches either are in partnership with an existing church, or they've built kind of a network hub, a centre, that is actually helping them and equipping them through that, whether that's providing kind of insurances and child safety training and all of that sort of stuff. I actually think a single micro-church existing on itself is going to fall into some of those issues if they don't somehow partner. So I've been working with Andrew Hill, who works for the Baptist Union of Victoria on micro-churches, and he's just started something called the Micro-Church Network. And basically, he's gathered all these scattered micro-churches that have been existing on their own and brought them into one network under the BUV together to try and help them actually cover off some of those things, but also so they've got some support and encouragement, so they're learning from one another, and there is some accountability and oversight, which I actually think Scripture calls us to be leaders who fall under accountability. So if we're single micro-church leaders and we don't fall under anybody, then I actually think we're out of line with what Scripture calls us to. So I think there's a need to submit to others in leadership and to have that accountability. So yeah, it's been a challenging space, but actually I feel it's easier than I've been in youth ministry before going into microchurches for about 10 years, and it's so much more complex because you've got all these teenagers who have no parents around, and the requirements are quite strict, whereas when you've got families around, it's a little bit easier. So. Any other questions, thoughts, comments?
Where does, you've said that you're in youth ministry. I've got teenagers
Yep.
as well. We know that having a relationship for young people with their peers is vitally important. If you're just got micro churches going through, where do those big communities come from for the younger kids? So they can bounce off, because someone that I agree with and someone that I'm going to want to socialise with or do church with may not be or have children of the same equal age as mine. Which means that, or, I've got 3 kids as well. So if I've got 2 that are happy, then is the third, you know what I mean?
So we've done micro churches all the way through with our kids, and we've done them with families of similar age and stage, and they've usually been reaching intentionally at that stage. So where we're at the moment, my 16-year-old is launching her own micro church with kids in year 11 and 12, so that VCE kind of section with some young adult and other people who are stepping in to help and support them do that. But our community is really focused on reaching the more junior high end. And so we've actually flipped our micro church. It's a bit of an experiment to be a teenage-centric micro church. So our boys kind of run it with the other couple of families that have teenagers. and they're the ones really shaping what we're doing and talking about how we do that. Now, of course, we're around them and we're reaching the parents around them. And so it's kind of got this, it's a bit of an experiment for us in that kind of teenage space. Our last community before this one, where our daughter was more of a younger teenager, had lots of teenage girls involved. So they kind of they had that peer group in it. This one, not so much. So we're actually kind of starting from scratch with this and working with a local neighbourhood house and connecting with teenagers in that neighbourhood house and bringing that sort of together. So that's where we're going at the moment with it. There's a lot of good, and I think underestimated sometimes in churches, of kids having other adults in their lives and investing into them.
Yep.
Yes, they need the peers.
They need their peers
Yep.
and
They need their peers, but I think we in youth ministry give them 30 peers and 2 or 3 adults, whereas in micro churches they probably have the same amount of peers as they do other adults investing in their lives. And I actually think that's, well, for us that's been a really positive space and a space of growth, certainly for our kids in that space. So it depends. I've seen micro churches do it lots of ways. There's one out in Mernda Doreen. There's a micro church that's basically running a youth ministry. So they're a group of parents and a couple of young adults that are joined together as a micro church, and their mission is running like a more typical youth ministry for their kids and some local kids around them, and they're trying to reach families through doing that. They wouldn't call it a youth ministry; they'd call it whatever they call their micro church. But yeah, so they're kind of going about it that way. There's various different ways that I've seen people do it. And the other thing we've done is actually run micro church youth ministries. So there's a paper on academia that I wrote about a missional communities model of youth ministry, where we actually built kind of smaller communities for youth that had young adult leaders, and then we'd call spiritual parents, so that kind of elders of older people actually investing into that space. And then they ran their own micro church, and 3 weeks of the month they'd be either in their micro church doing their own kind of community stuff or outreach, and then once a month all those youth communities would come back together for worship. So there's lots of ways that you can use micro churches in that sort of space. So if you're interested in that, there is a paper online that I've written about that I presented in 2015 for the International Association for the Study of Youth Ministry when it was in Melbourne. So there's various different ways that you can do it. So we're currently working with the neighbourhood house, and we've kind of given our boys, our 12 and 14-year-olds, kind of the ropes of our youth ministry, of our missional community, along with another pair of teenagers that belong to another family. And then we've got 2 other teenagers that are kids of a family, a parent that's involved in a microchurch, but they're not kind of, they're not believers or kind of core as kids. So those 6 kids are kind of the core at the moment of what we're doing, and then they're reaching other kids at the neighbourhood house. So that's been their approach. Any other questions? Otherwise I want to jump into the actual guts of microchurch before we break for lunch, and then in the afternoon we'll talk about kind of discipleship and multiplication. No? Awesome. Great. Well, let me move into talking more specifically about what microchurches are, but let me start by talking about what they're not, because I think there is some... is that working? Oh, no, it's Andrew. Nice. Oh, it was working. Good. Yay. There you go. Exciting. Because I think there is a lot of talk out there about what microchurches are, and some of it comes out of some of the original missional movements. So when people like Frosty and Hirsch actually started these missional communities, like Frosty's one was in Sydney, the Small Boat Big Sea kind of community, and Hirsch's one was in St Kilda, and they were kind of these rogue against the church kind of communities that existed in isolation. And I think some of that mentality, even some of the house church mentality from that movement, so the house church movement in the 70s was huge. People moved into their homes, they did church on their own. Neither of those really had a heart for multiplication, right? So both what Frost and Hershey did were about reaching a particular group of people, but they were never intending to multiply it. And the house church movement, well, it had more of an intention to multiply, but it had less of intention for mission. So in each of these movements, we've seen some of these elements kind of highlighted, but not others. But I think we've ended up with this view that microchurches could be either unhappy, a disgruntled group of people who are not willing to, or they're not happy with their local church, so they've gone off to do their own thing. In my experience, that's not the majority of people involved in microchurches these days. Most people who are doing it because they sense God calling them to reach a particular subgroup of people. They're not generally unwilling people who are not willing to submit to leadership and authority, although Australians generally, I think, are not willing to submit to leadership or authority. There is no more of that within microchurches than there are within everyday churches, right? We all have people in our church that don't want to submit to authority, and sometimes ourselves included, right? So that's. I don't think that's any more in a microchurch than other. A microchurch is not an inward-focused group of friends who enjoy each other's company and a bit of mission on the side. And I think that is a risk for microchurches, that they become inward-focused. And I'm working with a church at the moment that has definitely kind of gone that way. Some of their microchurches have been the same for about 5 or 6 years, and they haven't actually changed or grown or multiplied. And so they've ended up going quite inward. And of course, I've already spoken to the fact that microchurches are not new, right? This is something that God has been doing throughout history. That's not actually something different. So when we think specifically about the shapes and the structures of microchurch, so we talked about what a church is, that minimal ecclesiology of Jesus-centred worship, community, mission, and in partnership with the broader body of Christ. When we look at Scripture, we can see that there is also 2 different structures that we see. There is the public setting, and then there is the home setting. So you can see in Scripture there's the gathering all at Jerusalem when the Council of Churches came together. You see in the Jerusalem church and in the Corinthian church that both are called, when you come together, do this or do that. But we also see examples of churches, and they use the word ecclesia, meeting in people's homes. And there's about 6 or 7, I think, in Scripture all up of these different churches that meet in homes and places like that. And so we see this both and. And I think our temptation, given our history as churches, is to see them as like our worship service and our small groups. But that's actually not. Like, if you have a look through Scriptures and you see what Jesus did in homes and you see what Paul did in homes, it's not that typical church kind of gathered celebration, worship, and then small group Bible study. That's not actually what we see happening in Scripture. The primary place that they celebrated the Lord's Supper was homes. And it was a big love feast, and the baker would bring the bread, and the guy who grew the grapes would bring the wine, and other people would bring food, and whatever was left over went to the poor. But that happened in people's homes. That didn't necessarily happen in the colonnade, although it did as well, and we see that in Acts 2 kind of holds these 2 together beautifully. But we see that both are a place of mission, both are a place of outreach, both are a place of teaching. There isn't that sort of differentiation that we tend to put into these spaces. Both are places of conversion. There's both places of miracles and mission and teaching. And there's so many times that you see in Scripture, particularly Paul, where it says, and he went and ministered in the temple and in the home, and he went and ministered in the temple and the home. And he holds both of these 2 together. And that's partly why, when it comes to microchurches, I'm a bit a fan for that dual systems methodology, where you actually have a sense of that gathering together and also the scattering as the smaller community. So our current church plant is a microchurch plant. We meet fortnightly in microchurches and fortnightly together, because I see that in Scripture. I see that holding together of both the gathered and the scattered. And so this leads me to where I land with a microchurch. This is my definition of a microchurch. It's still a work in process, but it's a small, Jesus-centred community of disciples born out of a love for God and a love for a particular people or place, empowered by the Spirit to demonstrate and proclaim the gospel in contextually relevant ways in order to make disciples. These communities multiply to reach every part of our society in partnership with the wider body of Christ. That's a microchurch. So it's small, it's Jesus-centred, it's not model-centred, it's not people-centred. And it's not coming because we want to, convert a whole group of people, but genuinely because we want to love them. Because we love God and we genuinely love the people that we're seeking to reach. So we're currently involved with our personal microchurch is involved with a neighbourhood house, and I love them. The Nadini, the lady who runs our microchurch, is a person of peace, and I just love her. She's playing netball with me. Now we play netball on Tuesday nights with some of our people of peace from that community. And I would love to see her come to know Jesus, genuinely, but I just really appreciate her as a friend, and I want to invest in our friendship and our life together. And I think that's important because Australians can pick that a mile off, right? When we're just trying to do something to get someone through the door, or Australians, we don't have a lot of tolerance for that sort of stuff. So it's got to be born out of a particular love for a people or a place or whatever it is that God is kind of pushing you towards. And that's why I think there's such an important role for actually discernment and the work of the Spirit in this space. Empowered by the Spirit to demonstrate and proclaim the gospel in order to make disciples, right? This is all about making disciples. Contextually driven ways to make disciples in order to multiply in partnership with the broader body of Christ. So let me speak into each of those elements that you see in there. Maybe, oh yeah, there we go. Size. Size is important because it's small enough to actually make disciples, but large enough to actually have a community impact. Let me give you an example. When we ran a micro-church around my kids' primary school quite a few years ago, we would show up as a micro-church to the, like a working bee that the school would have. Now, working bees are pretty poorly attended by local government primary schools, right? And we'd show up with our group of kind of 15 adults and our tribe of kids that came with that, and people would kind of go, and we did time it to all turn up at like 10 o'clock or whatever time we were all coming, and people would be like, wow, why are you guys all coming? Like, because our kids go here, all our kids go here, we love this school, we want to serve this school. It made an impact. People noticed. Like if I showed up as a Christian who wanted to invest in my school, that's great, but nobody would notice. But when we show up with 15 people to do something, they notice. So at the neighbourhood house, they had I think it was their 5-year anniversary celebration for being a neighbourhood house for the last 5 years or something like that. And we all showed up. Some of us served on the door, getting money. Some of us sold raffle tickets. Some people painted faces. I can't remember what other people did. But when we show up as a group, and there was like 8 of us or 9 of us who show up into a small space where, the team running that event is 4 or 5 people. So we bring our 8, and suddenly we've, doubled the size, tripled the size of the team, and people notice, people ask questions. So there is a sense that there is a power in numbers. And I think that's one of the things that when we send people from our churches and we say, go witness to your workplace, and they're standing there on their own, it's really hard for them to do that. And I don't know if you've ever been in a conversation where somebody's asked you a question about your faith and you're the only Christian standing there. How much easier it is to answer that when you know you've got another Christian beside you. In part because they're going to hold you accountable to whatever answer that you give, but also because if somebody has makes a crack or a comment back, you've got someone else there standing beside you. Now imagine the power of that if there's 8 of you standing there. And actually, to a degree, in a lot of those spaces, you end up being a large number, or maybe not a majority, but getting close to, right? That actually empowers people to speak with much more boldness, I think, than otherwise. But it's still small enough to actually do life together, to actually really do that work of discipleship. Edward Hall is a guy who actually studied something called proxemics, which is like sizes and how people react in different social situations. And he kind of broke down the different sizes, like there's this intimate, there's personal, there's social, and there's public spaces. And it actually explains a lot of things. So, for example, in a public space, most people don't want to come within kind of 12 metres of the front. So if you think about your churches and why nobody ever sits in the front rows, it's because there is actually this kind of dynamic that in a public space, we don't expect to get within 12 metres of somebody. Whereas in a personal space, or in a social space, it's like 3 to 5 metres. So with this sort of number, I'm allowed to stand this close to you and you won't feel like I'm impinging on your space, right? If we're in a big public space, an auditorium of 100 people, and I came right up to you guys at this table, you'd feel like really, like, what's she going to do back? Oh, do I need to lean back in my chair? And you see it. There is this kind of dynamics that works with spaces. And of course, when you get personal and intimate spaces, you get your personal space. People are allowed within this kind of 1 metre bubble up to that far and no further. And then it's only... There you go. Well, yeah, that's true. It is. It's 1.5 now. I have to tell Edward Hall he has to change his work. And then you've got that intimate space, right? And there's very few people who are allowed within that 1.5 metre bubble. And it's kind of what microchurches speaks into, but without necessarily being intentional about it. When we create those social spaces, we create those spaces where people can come within, 3 to 5 metres and they can mingle with one another, but they're not pushing into your personal space. I don't know if you've ever gone as a new person into a small group where you didn't know anybody. It can feel quite confronting, especially if it's only 6 or 8 people sitting around. there's almost, you have to speak, right, in that sort of context. You can't sit back and say nothing because it's really obvious. But when you're in a group of, say, 20 or 25, you can sit there and say nothing. And that's okay. So it's much easier for a new person to enter that space of like 20 or so people, even 15, than it is to enter a new space as 6. And that's a secular concept called proxemics that actually kind of defines all of that. But you see it play out in microchurches, because when you've got that kind of 12 to 40, that's my experience in Australia, that's the general numbers that seem to work well with microchurches. But once you get beyond 12, people can come in and they can watch on the sidelines if they're not ready to speak. And they can come in and when they're ready, they can actually engage and be known still. It's not big enough that they kind of come in and go out without anyone talking to them. Right? If you've got a room of 25, the likelihood that someone can come in, spend an hour with you and walk out without being spoken to is pretty slim. But in a room of 50, 60, 70, that's actually a possibility. Especially if you've ever tried breaking into new small churches or things where you've walked in, you can sit at the back, you cannot engage with anyone and then walk out afterwards. And so it kind of plays on that metrics of size and that social space. In the New Testament, that's the space of that kind of oikos, that extended family. So what was in the home, we think of home as, me, my husband and my 3 kids. But in that time, of course, that would have been extended family plus servants and others. So it could have been somewhere from 25 to, research says up to 70 people would be in those households, which is crazy. But that was that sense of that kind of household environment, was that social space. And I think that size dynamic is actually really important, because it is a size that you can actively disciple people and touch base with people and work out where they're at, but it's also a size where people can enter without feeling too much pressure. The second distinct thing of a microchurch is a no-brainer. They are Jesus-centred. I do say it's a no-brainer, but there's a lot of times I think where our churches are not focused around Jesus. Graham Hill's an Australian theologian, actually, and he says there's 2 big issues with the church. The 2 biggest issues in the Australian church are that we lack conformity to Christ and we lack cruciformity. So we don't look like Jesus and we don't serve or sacrifice like Jesus. And he's done all of this review of his book, Global Church. He's got 2 volumes. One's from the Western Church, one's from the non-Western Church. And then reviewing all of that and coming back to look at the Australian church, he says that's our 2 issues. It's not the sexual revolution pushing into the church. It's not individualism pushing into the church. It's that we don't look like Jesus. We don't walk and treat people the way Jesus did. And we don't serve like Jesus. We're not cruciform. We don't seek to sacrifice. We've kind of bought that kind of comfort and security, and we've sold out to that. And so actually I think the importance of microchurches is that you can actually it's small enough that you can try and keep that focus on what does it look like to live like Jesus? What does it look like to walk like Jesus? One of the examples I remember from that day that we rocked up at the working bee is, we're all serving together, and one of the people who came with us, who's a believer, started getting grumpy and saying some things he shouldn't have said. And we said, hang on. I was like, somebody took it. I don't know. I can't remember what they took. They took something that he was using. They should have asked first. I'm like, hang on, mate. What did Jesus say? And unlike, churches where we tend to disciple people in small groups and then send them out on mission, as we do mission together, we can make sure that Jesus-centeredness kind of flows through everything that we do. The way that we serve at that working bee, the way that we serve at our neighbourhood house, all of that needs to be Jesus-centered. And that means actually we talk about the words, the works and the ways of Jesus. How are we actually living out what Jesus said? How are we living out what Jesus did? And how are we living out the way that he did it? That's what it means to be Jesus-centered. So they're small, they're Jesus-centered. They've got a missional identity, and this is probably a thing that is really unique to microchurches, is they're birthed when a small group of people kind of collectively sense a leading from the Spirit to invest in a particular community or people group. Everything that they do is wrapped around that. Those people are not their project, they're not their kind of mission arm, they are who they gather for. So our current microchurch that we're a part of called The Village has a heart and a kind of a God-given heart to serve families of teenagers around that Notting Hill neighbourhood house. And there's a couple of things that broke our heart and led us to that. One was that in that area, they used to have a secondary school, and a freeway basically cut through the middle of it and left this little section of Notting Hill on its own, kind of cut off from the rest of Mount Waverley, which is where it was kind of originally connected to. And it basically killed the suburb. It killed the area. The high school shut down, and so the teenagers in this area travel. Oh, I get goosebumps when I talk about this. They travel ages to get to schools, and nobody cares. And they're kind of, Notting Hill is zoned into like 3 or 4 different public schools where they're kind of all shoved in different directions to try and reach the closest public school. They get a tough run. Like a lot of other schools and areas, their whole suburb gets to go to that school, but this suburb and these teenagers kind of get broken and torn into pieces, and so they don't have a lot of connection or relationship. But the one thing they have is that community house, which is at the centre of that community. And it is the one thing that is trying to say to these teenagers in this area, you matter to us, and you're important, and you've got value. And I'll take a breath. But you can see what I mean. There is a sense that God has put that on our heart as a burden for these kids, that there should just be like, they have a right to be a community and a space and a people that know their value and their love. And Notting Hill just doesn't have that. It's just kind of been ripped apart. And we really want to restore that in that community, that identity, and just help them to see that they have God-given value in that space. And that's what it means to have a missional identity. It's not to have a project. They're not a micro church that, goes out and serves in a soup kitchen. They might, but they might serve in the soup kitchen because of their heart for the particular issue that they're reaching. The funniest micro church, I shouldn't say it's funny, the one that shocked me the most is I had a lady come up to me when I was working at GWAC and we were launching this network, and she said, I've got a real heart to reach women who are working full-time who do craft on Friday nights to relax. And I went, how is that going to make a micro church? And I remember as I was thinking that through, being convicted by God, going, why not? I went, okay, well, you go pray about it and I'll go pray about it. We'll come back together and see what God might have us do with this. And I remember thinking, this is the weirdest thing. Like, it's so easy when someone says this area or this neighbourhood or this particular people group or, Mandarin-speaking mums of toddlers, yep, got that. But women who work full-time who want to spend their Friday nights doing craft to relax. I'm like, really? Okay. So anyway, we prayed about it for a week or two, came back together, and to be honest, I don't know if it was because it was so crazy and weird or because it was God kind of prompting me to do so. I said, okay, let's give it a go. And in that time, she'd talked to another woman who was really keen. So they had the 2 of them. I said, well, you almost got your 3-legged stool, which is what we talked about for them to get launched. I said, I'll give you a platform time at the gathered church that we have and, share your vision and see what happens. Well, what happened was I think she got about 4 or 5 women who all put their hands up, who were so passionate about this, who were already spending, 2 of them were already spending Friday nights with a friend doing craft together because that's how they relaxed. And their husbands would often go out to the footy or whatever. But it was like a 21-year-old, she was a lady in her 50s, and the oldest one was like an 80-year-old. And it became this most beautiful intergenerational community who all just liked to relax by doing craft together, and were all people basically in quite high stress jobs where they're expected to be kind of high competency, high leadership, and all they want to do is knit or make quilts or do something to relax. And I remember thinking, how is this a missional group? But she's gone on to be an incredible leader, and she now actually has gone on to work for a missional organisation from being a woman working in the corporate world. She's ran this community for about 4 or 5 years and saw quite a few women come to faith. She went and did some theological study, and now she's working for a missional organisation. So, don't ever judge what God might do with some of these things, but that sense of an identity, a heart for a particular people. And I think it's got to come from that. Like, there has to be a sense that your heart has been won over for these particular people for whatever reason that might be. But there is 2 sorts. We'll get to that in a second. The other distinctive is they're simple. So if you go to the Church of Christ, Vic Tas talk about their simple church network. It's the same thing. I can't remember who in New South Wales is using the term simple church. I think it might also be Church of Christ in New South Wales that uses that term simple. The idea is this is not supposed to be bigger than Ben-Hur. It is not a huge program to run. We use the phrase lightweight, low maintenance, right? The joy of a micro-church is we're able to adapt to whatever it is the Spirit might be leading us to do, right? If it's heavy, if it's highly programmed, if it's rostered, we don't have rosters in micro-churches. It's too complex. It's too hard to move when you get a sense that the Spirit is leading you to respond. So this coming Saturday, our micro-church is actually going to serve another micro-church who's got a family in need with 3 kids who are moving house, and it's a bit of a messy, hard family situation. But they just rang and said, look, I know you run this micro-church network in Melbourne, but we're another micro-church and we could do with a hand, but we've all got young children. So they're micro-church of families with like 6-year-olds and below, and it's like crazy. But this family, which has 3 of them, 3 littlies, said, we need help, but we can't help. Like, we've got toddlers. If we go to help you move house, it's going to be a disaster. But we know you guys, and they knew me, and we know you've got a community that's kind of mostly teenagers and young adults. Do you reckon you guys could come and help? And we're like, oh yeah, no worries. We've kind of planned something, but drop it and move and do what needs to be done. And there's a sense that in micro churches that's very easy to do because it's not necessarily planned week to week. There is a sense of rhythms in what you're doing, but there is also a sense of flexibility. And I think that's really important. So it's got to be kept simple and lightweight to be able to respond to what God is doing. We even talk about that in terms of our discipleship, but we'll talk about that later too. And then, of course, I really think this is important, that micro churches are there to multiply. So the longevity of a standard church plant is usually done through growing, right? It stays long term because it continually grows and becomes an established church and a larger church. But in micro churches, the longevity isn't from kind of growing one micro church and keeping it for 10 years. The longevity is from that kind of spreading wider and broader. So you'll notice from the map of our kind of micro church network, the one at the start didn't exist at the end, but a whole lot of other ones did, and a whole lot of other people had moved into church and other ministries and spaces because of that micro church at the start, even though it no longer existed. So the longevity of micro churches is actually in its multiplication. And my theory is that every micro church needs to multiply within 3 years or be kind of shut down and restarted because they lose their missional edge. So my guess is in Australia, the best kind of context, Philip Qua, who works for Church of Christ, argues with me and says it's only 2. I think it's 3. Basically, every 3 years, these micro churches need to be rebirthed or multiplied because otherwise they lose their kind of edge and their discipleship. If you start, for example, reaching families like we did, families of toddlers or whatever, in 3 years' time you're actually reaching families of primary schoolers because your kids have changed from being toddlers to primary schoolers, and so your vision needs to change. So if you are actually reaching a people group, likelihood is in 3 years that will have adapted. So one of the ones that we did start was the Mandarin speaking community, and we're in Glen Waverley. So if you know Glen Waverley, that's a no-brainer. That's in, where it was that 2013, 2014, massive migration from mainland China. Everybody was starting ESL classes. We were really intent not to do that. And so we spent a lot of time with this couple who wanted to run it, walking and just praying through the neighbourhood. And every time we walked with them, we did this 3 times, we ran into exactly the same kind of dynamic. A woman or a grandmother with a toddler who, as far as we could tell, had pretty good English, but she didn't think her English was very good. And so she wasn't willing to go out. So often the fathers or husbands or whoever was in that sort of space would go off to work. The older kids would go to school, and so they all had social connections. They all had, really top English skills. But often the mothers or the grandmothers and those with toddlers were kind of left at home and just didn't have the confidence to go out. My view, their English was really good. Like, we could hold conversations, and I didn't speak Mandarin. The couple with me did speak Mandarin. But they didn't have the confidence to go out. And so that missional community took it upon themselves to kind of run a language cafe cross playgroup thing that actually served the kids, gave social connection for those women together, but also helped them gain the confidence to go out and engage in just everyday life. And it wasn't that they needed them to, because we would say the English was great, but it was gaining that confidence in that space. And that, when it comes to multiplying that community, so that went to, saw lots of people come to faith in that sort of toddler age group, But then, of course, those toddlers growing up became kids, and that's when it moved towards a congregation, in part because they were looking for a place where their kids could, they've heard about Sunday schools, and, great, so let's launch it into a congregation. If it had stayed trying to reach people with toddlers, well, to be honest, the migration into our area had changed by then, and that wasn't who we were seeing migrating in 3 years later than what we saw in that space. So I think it's one of those things, it's about being agile and responsive to what God is doing, and you've got to actually review it every 3 years, because otherwise you tend to multiply into, you tend to lose touch with those who you're trying to reach. There are two specific sorts of micro-churches. One, I have found the specific kingdom one is the one I've mostly been talking to you about. That's where there is a clear missional focus and everyone works together for that focus. So that's, the families of teenagers, that's the Mandarin-speaking community, that's the Monash University students, where they've had a clear focus. That, I would say, is usually one of the more fruitful types of micro-churches. But there is a second type, which is called a distributive micro-church. And so we've multiplied these out, and this goes into how you multiply them as well. But these are actually where there's kind of people coming together who all have similar lifestyles or similar stages, but don't have a shared particular vision. So, for example, we ran one for families for a while that was like this, where the families went to different primary schools. They're all engaged in mission with families and primary schools, but there were some in Vermont, there was some in Glen Waverley, and there was some where we were in Scoresby. And so there were kind of 3 suburbs, but what we did is we supported each other in their missions in different spaces. So while we didn't all hold that mission, it looks like some of us going over and joining to serve at the Vermont Primary School, even though we went to Scoresby. And some of them going and having dinner with couples from Scoresby and their friends, even though they're from Vermont. And partly I think these are often used when you've got, when you're starting to get off the ground and you're trying to get these more specific micro-churches going, but there just isn't enough of a cohort to do that. And so one of the things that we came up with doing that was about this kind of dinner of 3s. So we would invite our person of peace or someone that we've been talking to about faith or reaching out, and we would bring someone else from our micro-church in, and we would gradually create these kind of networks of 3s that all crossed over until everybody actually kind of got connected with one another. And distributed micro-churches are important because what happens is you tend to see 1 or 2 of those little visions that exist start to grow, and then you can actually birth that out as a separate micro-church on its own. Whereas when you look at multiplying churches that are like micro-churches that have got a set vision, often you see a bit of conflict or a bit of divide forming in the community. So we had a community that came out of the distributive one in our area and planted in Vermont. It grew up in Vermont and got larger, but then it kind of got to this point where there were some at the secondary school and some at the primary school and starting to reach different people. And there was, I don't know how to say it other than like a little bit of a rub or conflict. When we're talking about what we need to do to reach people, there was this sense of, just 2 different visions basically starting to emerge. And that for us was a good sign that it's actually time to multiply those into 2 specific different micro-churches. And so you can see when you're multiplying from that kind of distributive model, you're almost like birthing off just little pieces of groups. Whereas when you tend to multiply from the mission-specific one, it's usually because as you've reached someone in that mission-specific group, they've grown or that group's grown, and you end up kind of, I don't like to use the word dividing, but kind of multiplying into two groups. So one of the other ones we did was around a high school, but within that high school they started to reach single mums, a lot of single mums, a lot of mums of divorce, again with teenagers. And so that one ended up being one that we were about to divide before I finished up at GWIC. That was about to multiply and go into 2 different directions. And even though they started reaching standard families at that secondary school, what they ended up reaching was another subgroup that was not just from that secondary school, because it connected around the area in various different ways. And so that ended up being a second one as well. So the type of multiplication depends a little bit on the type of micro-church you have, but either I think is a valid form. And then the final distinctive of micro-church, of course, is partnership. For me, that's a really important one, whether that's partnership with a local church, partnership with a denomination, partnership with other micro churches, whatever it is. I think we're called to be in unity without uniformity. I think that's Ephesians 4 in a nutshell, right? We grow and we sharpen one another into maturity because we're not all the same, and that's actually what helps us to grow. Any questions on that? That's the kind of basic summary of what I would call a micro church. Any questions on that before I move on to one?
When should a micro church consider being a church?
Do you mean a church plant in its own right, or when does a group of people become a micro church? Sorry, I didn't see who that was from. It echoes when it's not muted. We were playing around with this idea a bit at GWAC because we had 2 hubs basically that had grown. So we encouraged all of our micro churches at GWAC to come back to the centre at least once a month to join in with what we were doing as a larger church, to be encouraged and things like that. When we planted into Monash Uni, we reached a whole group of people who were very different than the people who go to Glen Waverley Anglican Church. So if you know, GWAC's in a pretty high academic area, it's a pretty upper class area, and we found that at Monash Uni we were reaching kind of the exact opposite of that. We were reaching struggling students, people from poorer families, particularly people from country families as well. And the idea of getting some of those people to sit through a 30 to 40 minute sermon back at that home church was just not going to happen. Not only that, what they wore and their colour of their hair and things would have just raised so many questions back at our kind of base church. It just wasn't going to happen. We had reached a whole group of people who were they weren't de-churched people, if you know what that phrase is kind of about. They were completely unchurched and would have never considered going into a church, but they'd come to faith through this micro church in Monash Uni. And then when that multiplied, we had these 2 communities there that were of very similar nature and loved one another actually quite a lot. And when they multiplied, it was a bit of a grief process as well. So they wanted to come back together as them once a month. And so we just got this sense from God that actually maybe they were better off as their own network of micro churches. They were so far removed, and they were about 4 generations removed of micro churches from our original church plant. But also there was at least 2, and there was actually a 3rd one starting. And so when I think of hubs, in terms of what you'd make into a church plant, I think you're looking for ideally 3 micro churches. And it's just from experience. When you have 2, you have them and us. When you have 3, you have all of us. And I can't give you any more grounded reason for that. You can call it the Trinity or something like that. But there's no grounded reason except that we found that when we had communities in pockets of 3, they tended to have a sense of identity about them and just a really healthy balance. So in the Vermont one, we'd had the primary and secondary one, and we were birthing off this other one around single families. There weren't all single families involved in it, but people with a heart for that. That was where we were going to do a second church plant. It got cut off by some leadership changes at our church and some complexities that we kind of faced at that time. But yeah, the idea we were looking for was where we saw 3 micro churches together to make a network. I guess from the same reason as I'll talk about later around leadership, is that we found 3 in a leadership team was important, because if one struggles, if one family goes through some really serious sickness or something, if you've only got 2, everything falls on the other one. And I think the same is true for a micro church network. So we planted Sent Collective with 3 micro churches, and I'll be honest, the one my daughter's running is struggling a bit at the moment. And if we'd only planted with 2 and hers was struggling, then we'd really just be 1 and it wouldn't be a church plant. But because we've got 2 functioning micro churches plus this other experiment in the hands of a 16-year-old teenager, that gives it that sense of a church plant. So I would say 3 is what I'm looking for in some sort of proximity or grouping together, whether that's a network proximity, like they're all part of a similar grouping of people, or a neighbourhood, like a geographical proximity. I expect that we'll see kind of micro churches kind of spread out from wherever they're originally placed, and at some point you just get too far to have any connection back to the centre. So yeah, does that answer your question? Yeah.